Thank you very much for introducing me, and I'm very proud that I'm and happy that I can talk to all of you, and very grateful to be invited. It's an honor for me to talk. So I try to share my presentation here. Can you see, Teresa?
Yes.
Good. Also the full screen?
Yeah, perfect.
Yeah, fine. Okay, ladies and gentlemen, welcome to my talk here, and together with Knut, I'm very happy also to talk with him together on a similar topic from a little bit different perspective. We have a lot of similarities and also some differences at the end. We will discuss about it. So what I talk about based on my expertise through my whole life until now is about skating technique and how to teach and develop skating movements. The plan is, as we see, so we're about 1 hour 20, very short discussion, then we have this coffee break, and then Knut will talk and he will have a little bit longer discussion, and maybe I join in back if you have common questions to us. So that's what was already introduced. So that's the structure of my talk. I will a little bit talk about biathlon, how complex the sport is. In the next step, that it is steadily changing and that it developed a lot, and by what reason that is and which aspects we see behind that. I will go into, because I have to, a little bit look at the performance factors in biathlon. Very complex, of course, we have the shooting and other things, but I will try to a little bit screen that and pull out the technical aspects in the sport. Very important to discuss basically is what is an optimal technique? How is that defined? What is it really? That's not so easy to define always, but we will find a way to give some examples here of optimal skating techniques in different aspects. I will not go into the whole biomechanics, that would be far too much, but I will show the one or other example. And of course, as soon as we know what is optimal for our target group, is it kids, is it youth, is it elite sport, is it female, is it male, is it well-trained, not well-trained, then we need to understand which options do we have to develop this technique, to change it, to learn something new, to maybe relearn something, to break an old pattern, and so on and so on. That's a complicated process, and we have several options, and not all options are working with all skiers. But we will see that, and it's a little bit also sometimes trial and error and to get a feeling for the athletes, but there are certain guidelines to go into. Then I will go pretty much deeper with some examples in the technique micro training, I call it. You will see and understand what that means. And at the end, we will have some questions and perspectives. So biathlon, a complex sport, it's definitely complex. It's not so difficult to explain and understand. It's you could also call it a motoric El Dorado. It's definitely one. Also cross country, but biathlon even more due to the shooting aspect. So we have many disciplines. We have different race modes. We have different distances. I don't have to repeat that. You know all that. And we have some new disciplines coming in. So it's coming the super sprint, very short distances, similar to cross country skiing, and that opens up a lot. If I remember back, 2001 was the first sprint event in cross country skiing, which changed tremendously many aspects in training and in the physical capacity of skiers. So let's see what's happening in biathlon, as it is so similar nowadays to cross-country skiing from the athlete point of view. We have, of course, different intensities due to the different distances and race modes. And we have a steady switch from very high load to lower load to medium load. It's a very high physiological and coordinative demand. It's extreme, so to say. It's very seldom in endurance sports if we compare running, cycling to biathlon and cross-country skiing. It's pretty unique. We have very high demands in stress management. That's far less in cross-country. It's far more in biathlon due to the shooting situation. And we have a lot of technique and motor skill demands. Because we have to change the techniques. We have a lot of different techniques, and we have to, in best way, adapt all our techniques to the changing terrain, to a fatigue status, to the situation in the race, etc., etc. So many techniques, of course. I mean, I don't also have to explain. It's just important to understand how complex it gets because we have so many. Due to the fact that we have so many, we should have a very high level in all those. I mean, no skier, so to say, has a top level in all skating techniques. So I don't find many. So honestly, it's some are very good in all, but it's not so many doing this. We have various modes of arm to leg movement coordination. So that's defining all our techniques. And we have a lot of changing track profiles and speed. So we have numerous techniques transitions, and we have numerous side changes in different skating techniques. In that point, we differ a lot in our level. So we find a lot of differences in the skill and ability to efficiently change techniques to make the transitions well done, and especially to be very good in both sides of the technique. For example, in V1 or V2 skating, V2 alternate skating. We have the shooting aspect. Gerald will talk about this tomorrow. I don't go into that at all, but of course it's also a very technical skill, and it's all about fatigue resistance during shooting, to be concentrated and focused. We have a lot of different changing environmental conditions. The snow is no meter the same, and certain snow conditions it gets really difficult to adapt our movements to those changing snow conditions, or weather conditions, or view conditions, sun, fog, good side, bad side, deep snow, soft snow. So it's unbelievably many challenges a skier is facing. So that's very difficult. So the challenge is that we have a very strong influence of the peripheric and of the central fatigue aspects on the technique in skiing as well as in shooting. So that's a big thing. Many skiers differ a lot in that skill to resist better to fatigue. This is partly trainable, of course. We will look in the methods, how it is. Should we train unfatigued technique, or should we sometimes train it very fatigued? So that depends very much how much we will do that, but I can say already now we need to do both. So fatigued and non-fatigued technique and coordination training, that's for sure, because we need a high level during the race and during the training. So we can say there's a very high complexity and a very high movement variability in biathlon sport, in skiing and shooting, but I talk more about skiing. And I always say that in all coach educations or to my students at university in sport, in training, there are, so to say, no recipes, and this is very fastly to be forgotten that there are some. It's not a cooking book. We have some strong guidelines. We know a lot and more, but we don't give out recipes. So the factor coach, the factor knowledge of the coach, and the factor what the coach is doing with the knowledge and how to apply it, and the experience level, that's still a big issue. Fortunately, it's good because otherwise we would have all brilliant coaches and brilliant athletes. So we have high and very new challenges and complex training situations. And I can say already now in terms of technique, it is not always to learn lots of stiff patterns. Skiing is it's more about to develop fast individual adaptability to changing conditions. And the variability of techniques has to be considered in training regimes, concepts, and plans. So it's not always to collect a lot of different patterns, to make them stiff, automize them, and then have a big pool of different patterns. It's more to have a neural network to switch between a lot of patterns and to very fastly adapt to a changing fatigue condition, to a changing stress situation in a race, mental stress, to changing fatigue conditions in the legs, in the upper body. It's one day more the breathing, it's one day more the muscle, etc., etc. That skills are to be developed in technique training mainly. I really have to emphasize that because it's a very, very important aspect in the whole story. So biathlon sport changes and changed and develops a lot, like also cross-country skiing, by different reasons. If we look at that graph, it's not up up to 2020, but it shows general tendency here from 2001 to 2014. If we look at man biathlon, this is the median curve in the middle, this dark one here, if you see that, try to find the pointer. So if you see this here, this is the median curve. So from 24 kilometers per hour, a little bit more in the median up to more than 25.5. So it's a clear tendency, 6.5% overall. And this median maximum, not nowadays, but lately, currently, is even higher than it was the maximum in 2001. That's very interesting. So there's a really big change. So this is the max, that's the maximum value in 2001, that this is lower than the median value in 2014-15. That's really a tremendous change, and the skiing speed really tremendously changed and increased. Not so clear in the women, also a tendency, especially 05 to 010, but not that clear like we have it in men. And that's a pretty interesting picture. In former times, we always discussed biathletes. If a biathlete is not so successful in biathlon, if an athlete is other way around. If an athlete is not so successful in cross-country skiing, maybe he can go to biathlon because there he doesn't have to ski so fast. This is definitely not true anymore. As we know, many examples. I mean, Björndalen could win a cross-country race, was starting a lot of events in 30 kilometers in Salt Lake, for example, or in some relays. Lars Berger was one of the examples who was a super strong skier also. So they are not weaker than cross-country skiers nowadays anymore at all. Or Gössner won almost in Val di Fiemme medal in cross-country skiing on 10K, and so on and so on. Or Mari from Finland won one sprint in cross-country skiing. So we see biathlon, and in those data you see those differences in different distances of races. This is biathlon average 12.9, cross-country average 13.8 in men. So this is in seconds, in average 1.3 seconds. From the fastest to the top 30. So it's 1% difference. In the women, it's a little bit more. It's 3.9 difference, but they are not so different anymore to cross-country skiers. So the physical capacity and the technique and whatever other factors really increased and got better. That's pretty interesting picture. Very interesting is also, as I said, it's not fully up to 2020 because I didn't have time to look into those data more. It's a bit older slide, but it also is interesting just to see it. We see here over all those years from 01 to 2013, in women and men, the same way, the amount in percent of World Cup podium finishers. So in women on the left side with the red bars, this is stagnation, so to say. So, and in a man, we have a very big increase from 29 to 39%. That means in these changes, the question is it the shooting or the skiing? And we see here how many percent of podium finishers have only one shot penalty. And that percentage in men having only one shoot penalty in the races, in the good groups, that 73 to 80 races here in those data, is tremendously increasing. So it gets tougher and tougher to be successful in male with the shooting here. So that there was a big change. In women, it's not a clear tendency, a little bit, but it's not so much. And if we look at the percentage, how many percent of podium finishers were in the top 5 skiing rank, so only the skiing time, the skiing performance, then we have a tremendous improvement in female, up to 62% of all, and in men it's a kind of stagnation, up and down. So it's pretty interesting what we see here. So to be on podium in women, shooting performance, small percentage changes only, but a big skiing performance change. And in men, shooting performance tremendously much, and not so much skiing performance change compared to the women. So that's pretty interesting picture, and important to see that changes are going on. So what else is changing? of course, we have a distinct improvement in shooting capacities in general. So in the standing shooting nowadays, 16 seconds shooting time, a little bit faster already even. And if you look at one athlete who I was caring for a while, Simonetta, in standing in training, he could shoot and hit the targets around 10 seconds. That's tremendously fast, and it's really unbelievable how fast that goes. So that's a big change. It must be a fast shooting to be successful. It's not possible other way. We have improved functional equipment characteristics. Of course, that's everywhere. So in cross country, we have better track preparation. We have in general increased physical capacities, strength and endurance. In biathlon, training is changing a lot over the years. We have better training methods and training regimes, which is very nation specific, of course, that cannot be generalized, so to say. And we have development of techniques and technique level in biathlon and other reasons. So what is changing? We see here very old pictures from 1936, Göttumsbrotten in the arrival. So he's also skating here, as we can see. This is Bill Koch, and now 2020. So of course, somehow skating develops due to material changes, and we have a bigger diversity of different skating techniques. And I just want to show a pretty extreme example here from my former working group. Thomas Stöckl and me made some analysis in double push skating, which is coming from inline skating. And I show this video here, and in cross country and in biathlon, partly it's used by certain athletes. And you can see on the left side the double push skating in V2 skate, and on the right side the original technique from inline skating. Chad Hedrick was one of the protagonists to develop that technique, and we tried to establish that in cross-country skiing, and I'm coming back later in the examples for technique. So you see a first push from the outside edge here. So that gives you some propulsion, then you jump and you push from the inside edge, immediately from the outside edge of the other ski. So that's a pretty new development, which is a little bit more established in cross-country skiing, in short sprints, in flat and in uphill. But it's a very important aspect, and it's pretty much faster on short distances if you have a so-called sprint situation. That gets more and more important the faster you ski. And in general, we can say that we have an increase of the mean sprint speeds from about 8 up to 10 meters per second in skating. That's really, really tremendously much. So that's the maximum speeds, of course, for a shorter distance. So that's about the changes and the challenges that we are facing nowadays in biathlon and cross-country skiing. And I want to go into the aspect of performance factors in biathlon, which is first a thought about all our experiences we have as coaches, of course, and we have some research on it. Marco and the others yesterday already talked about it. I wouldn't say it's so badly based by research, biathlon. It's coming more and more. We did several studies in shooting. Gerald will talk tomorrow in the University of Salzburg, and other groups did something on it. I mean, it's going on. It's a popular sport. Of course, it's not like running or like cycling, but it's coming more and more. And I think we can say more and more about performance factors. So what can it be? I mean, we have many screws to drill. We have a lot of possibilities to influence that, and then we must think about our target group. Which age are we talking about? Is it kids? Is it youth? Is it juniors? Is it seniors, or rather older athletes? So there are always differences to go into. So many screws and many possibilities and different ways to the podium. And I now start going into technique and say we have to note that technique and the combination to strength guides efficiency on the one hand and economy on the other hand. Efficiency is like in the car. It's about the percent of energy input we put into the whole movement into forward propulsion or forward power output from the legs, from the poles, or in combination, depending on the technique. So that's, I put in energy, forces to the ground. But the question is how much is coming back, and how much do I lose in the wrong direction or in deformation of my muscles or in warmth production or other things. That's one aspect, very, very important. That's everything about efficiency. And the second, let's say all we in the session here now would ski the same speed, but many of us use very little amount of oxygen, and others use very big amount of oxygen for the same power output and the same speed. So that's all about economy. So it's pretty critical, the role of technique and strength and in combination to each other, how big the influence is. And the best example is if we look to cross-country skiing, that's easier. If we compare, for example, one athlete today in top shape, able to win, let's say, a 30-kilometer skating race in cross-country, and 3 days later on the same distance, will not happen like this, but theoretically we assume this athlete won the skating race, but is about rank 80 to 90 in the classic race. So why should that be? It can only be assuming he doesn't have a bad day, assuming he's in the same condition physically like 3 days before in the skating race. It can only be his movement pattern. It's uneconomic and not efficient. And that's why technique in biathlon and cross-country skiing has a tremendously big meaning. That's not often so clearly understood, but it's really worth to invest a lot of time in technique development, even in elite sport, in youth sport anyway, and in kids even more. But it's a very important aspect what I'm talking about here. There are a lot of easy examples, easy to understand that technique plays a big role. That's far bigger than in many other endurance sports. It's far bigger than in running and cycling or even swimming. We have a lot of techniques. It's unique. And we have shooting in biathlon additional. So the skiing and the shooting technique, it's one mosaic stone of the performance, but it's a pretty, still a little bit underestimated cornerstone of performance in these Nordic skiing sports. If we look, I just try to make a schema with the ages here. I start with adults, and it's not complete. Don't nail me on the wall because it's several other aspects probably, but I was writing here shooting techniques, skating techniques, specific endurance, specific strength, frame conditions like equipment, personality, tactics, mental stress management, etc., etc. in adults, influencing the performance in biathlon and many other aspects. But I think skating technique and shooting technique we can write in pretty big letters, in the same almost big letters like I would say endurance and strength. If we go to youth, so I go younger and younger, I already write this a little bit bigger because in my opinion it needs to still be developed, automized. The pot of different neural networks has to be developed in that age still up to juniors, and it's a very, very important aspect, and I think it's even more important than in elite sport. Although I have to say it must be a daily part of elite sport training. And in kids anyway, so it depends now how we define children, but generally spoken, endurance and specific strength can be very, very small. It's more general approach here. We do a lot of different things, different sports, but skiing technique, and I don't even write skating technique, I say skiing technique, is generally spoken one of the most important things, and we need this games approach. We need to have all motoric key elements of skiing, edging, loading, gliding, turning, etc. in the whole training process, and this must be absolutely in the foreground by well-known reasons. I don't go into this too much, but that's totally clear. In shooting, yeah, I mean specific shooting maybe not, but playful targeting games. So different ways, different games of where you have to target and so on and so on. So that's pretty clear. And this schema here has of course consequences for training, and especially Knut will go a little bit more in those age groups and the general approach in the Norwegian Federation and in their concept, what they talk about. I go then a little bit more into the exercising at the end, because I think it's a very interesting and important aspect, a little bit more in detail. So we shifted to our second presentation a little bit more, but I think it should be clearly understood that there is a shift from older athletes down to very young athletes, how much we should put skiing technique or shooting technique into the foreground. The level of technique can be called kind of like a vehicle of skiing efficiency and economy. And here you see Toran Hetland not skiing anymore, but he was one of the best skaters in the world, especially in V2 alternate technique. And I just show you here one example, that you look at his arm swing, his dynamics, his push movements, etc., etc. If I can start it. This is a sprint in Bern in Switzerland. Fantastic movements here with his arm swing, one of the best arm swingers in the circus. And Fredriksen behind him can hardly follow with a V2 skate. This is Björndalen in Salt Lake, very old video, but elegant, rhythmic, economic, and efficient. As also Thomas Alsgaard was. He was one of the best in that technique in all times. Okay. So if we talk about technique training, then we need to have some understanding about what is the optimal technique. So what is this exactly? What means optimal? And can we define that? Is this a very narrow margin of technical solutions, or is it a rather bandwidth of solutions in biathlon? Or is it like where it's very narrow, rather narrow is in such sports like ice skating or gymnastics? So there are judges, there's subjective judgment, they give points, and the definition, what is a good salto mortale, is pretty narrow and pretty clear. I think we can agree on that in skiing, in alpine skiing, cross-country biathlon, and so on. It's rather a wider margin of optimal solutions. So we cannot press this down to one or a second example. In certain main aspects, yes, but not in the wider perspective of a skiing technique. In shooting, it's maybe the same. There's not one successful solution. There are different ones, and we really have to address that. It's very, very important not to try to put your own best technical solution and cover other athletes trying to fix them into this solution. It will not work. We have to understand more what is the individual aspects and what are the real technical aspects. So what is the optimal technique? What is that? We have different techniques, as we can see here. So that's a question. I just start here to summarize again what we have here. Some of them are not used at all so much in biathlon. For example, skating without poles, it's in general not used enough. It's a very efficient technique, and sometimes in sprints it could be used, or double push skate is also seldomly used until now. But we have all the techniques, 5 to 7, let's say, with all the nuances in between. It's even more if you categorize it in a little bit different way. So the techniques themselves we have. And technique training covers several aspects, which is not only to train the techniques, it's technique transitions. We have side transitions, quality differs often between left and right side within techniques. We have change of more upper body versus lower body focus techniques. It's very interesting aspects, because if we look on the left side in V2 up here, on the left side up, we know from research and from studies and measurements that depending a little bit on the incline, but we have about between 70 and 80% of propulsion is coming from the upper body and from the poles in V2. That's very important to know, because if I have a weak upper body athlete, I cannot tell him ski V2 in the steep uphill. It's actually the wrong race strategy. It's 70 to 80% coming the propulsion from the upper body in V2. And for example, in the right side down in V1, it's about 50-50. So I really have to think about it. What is the optimal solution for me as a skier, depending on my strength level in the upper body and in the legs, for example. So, and we have changes of more upper body techniques we do to more lower body techniques like skating without poles, although we even have the arm swing here. It's not unimportant. Then we have a percentage technique use over distance. So we can look at these patterns that come at the very end in the different devices we can use as a feedback system nowadays. Smart technology, we get exact numbers of how many percent we used V2, how many V1, how is the changing over laps or over fatigue within a long distance, within a short distance race. It's very, very interesting, this percentage of technique, of sub-techniques used in a race or in training. And this is also a factor what differs high performers versus low performers. Then, of course, that we normally, what I talk a lot today in the methods then is about the technical details. So I really take a technique, each technique, and go into the details. I want to improve the pushing movement, push-off movement, the arm swing movement, the leg swing movement, the glide phase, the rhythm overall, the complex coordination, and make that very smooth and economic and efficient. So that's the main thing, that if we make a video, we look at the details. But of course, in video training, it's very essential what we look at and how we film. I will shortly address that at the end. And a last point is the technique use and the fatigue effects of upper body and lower body. It's pretty individual. It's very interesting in biathlon. I shouldn't talk too long about it and we lose too much time here, but we made a study on fatigue effects on shooting performance in young athletes and top elite athletes. And we were fatiguing those athletes only in the upper body once, and then we made prone and standing shooting then once only in the legs, and we looked after at prone and standing shooting and the complex fatigue setup. It was very interesting to see the group when we fatigued them strongly in the legs, that the prone shooting got affected. So there must be something in the laying position when you stabilize and you have a counteraction laying on the ground with your legs, and your legs are totally blue, so to say, that you have a trouble to stabilize in prone shooting. And I was discussing this with Simon Eder a lot, and maybe you realize that, but at least he started to not to load his legs anymore so much, approaching the prone shooting. And that's pretty interesting aspects. You can look at individually how that is, and that's just some aspects that we talked about here. So technique is very, very wide. It's not only the details of the movement itself. That's why generally, if I talk about technique training, I talk about different levels of technique training. And that's very interesting also for different target groups. But we should work on all those things. So we have a so-called macroscopic versus microscopic level. And that needs different approaches and technique analysis. First we analyze and look where are the weak points. We measure maybe something, we see a lot as a coach, we're standing, we're making notes, we observe. And of course it has consequences for the training and the training concepts. So macro versus microscopic level in training. So what is macroscopic? It's highly fascinating how much we can do in technique training. So skill levels, if we talk about weaker and stronger skiers, are very different in the skill of highly variable technique choice. Not everybody is able to do it in the same way. So we have a variable adaptation to the steadily changing track profile and skiing speed to daily shape. Maybe we have upper body fatigue, we have lower body fatigue, whatever it is. But some athletes can very, very nicely adapt to these changed conditions. Some cannot. Some are very stiff in their pattern and they are not able to quickly, smoothly pack out another solution for the situation. But some can. And this I can, of course, train. If I stress people long enough with such different situations in training, somewhen they learn to be more adaptable, not to be so stiff in the pattern. Maybe it gets more clear if I say an example from alpine skiing. There were a lot of skiers in our federation. They were fantastic under certain conditions: powder snow, icy, sunshine. They were winning every race. As soon as there's some factor coming in, the ski is not perfect, the edges are too sharp or not sharp enough, changing snow conditions, some fog is coming, wind, their pattern is breaking down. They are not winning anything anymore. So that tells the story that others, like examples like Ligeti in US or Bode Miller was such a one, they could adapt immediately to every situation. And that's a skill. That's what I want to tell. It's the same in biathlon, in shooting and skiing, by the way. A very interesting aspect in a cyclic movement like skating is the skill of flexible technique adaptation to changing snow, changing ski, and changing wax conditions. It's a little bit more relevant in classic skiing with grip wax, but it's also relevant in skating, ski changes and snow changes. You know all the problem. It's also with the brand, with the ski joys. Some go very well in very hard conditions. For example, Rossignol or so, it's famous for that. Some are very good in soft conditions, and some are good in both conditions. So, I mean, conditions change, and we have to be adaptable. The system, the skier must adapt, and that's also a skill. And if that comes up, these changing conditions, then it's very interesting to watch the different abilities to play with cycle rate and cycle length, meaning skiing frequency and distance per cycle I cover, because velocity is the product of those both, as you can see here, cycle rate multiplied by cycle length. And a certain given velocity I can gain by high frequency and low cycle length. So small steps, so to say, and I don't travel a lot per cycle, or the other way around. I can produce a very big cycle length and have a pretty low frequency. But this has to be adaptable. As a skier must be able to do both, depending on the changed condition. That's a very interesting topic, and you find a lot of nice literature. And if you need some literature list on that, I can provide that afterwards. It's well analyzed in many cyclic sports, this aspect here, and it's pretty nicely correlated to performance in general in cyclic sports. We know that high performers in cyclic sports like skiing or kayak or rowing or swimming or running are rather high, long cycle length athletes. So they produce per cycle a big distance. Totally independent from anthropometrics, by the way. It's not depending so much if I'm rather tall or rather small. There are also small skiers who can produce extremely high cycle length in skiing. We found that pattern everywhere, and that already gives us direction in what we should work in technique training. We need skiers producing big cycle length, and rather not go to a mega high frequency. I mean, they can also go high frequency in high speeds, of course, because speed depends on that, but it's rather high cycle length skiers. That's the typical character of a good skier. Of course, we have exceptions, because that will come up, the question. We have exceptions. We see a lot of strong skiers who have a very, very high frequency, but that can be either because they are faster in that section. We cannot compare different velocities because that's depending on this product here written. If we would compare them on the same speed, then it's not so dramatically high frequency. So there are exceptions, of course, but generally it's rather high cycle length skiers. Another skill is to have active skiing in transitions from up to downhills in curves. So we're very often end of an uphill, a right side curve going to a downhill. We made a lot of analysis, worked with Wolfgang Bichler a lot together, and only that aspect gave us a lot of time back in the round to make them aware look at the transitions, focus on this, focus on that. You will gain a lot of seconds only by changing and focusing and solving it optimally. So it's these transitions, that's a very macroscopic thing. I don't go into details here technically, I just focus, how should I ski here? And when should I accelerate? And when do I go to the downhill position? Not too early, of course, for example. So it's things like that. And another thing is also the skill and the level of memorizing the track profile. That also differs athletes a lot from each other. So some can memorize very well and very accurately, and some have difficulties with that and they don't know their own racetrack so well. We did that intensively. We prepared all World Cup races and big events like Olympics and World Championships by kind of learning the track profiles. A cyclist is very good in this. They know really almost every meter, the good ones. And it's very important also, that's everything macroscopic. All influences technique, technique choice, and at the end, the skiing time, of course. So we see here an example in Sochi on the roller ski track of two athletes in such a transition phase. And we see the left is far kind of more efficient here in the solution. And the second one with a pretty extreme difference here, if you see, so uphill, already other technique chosen, and the curve is completely soft another way, and the acceleration into the downhill. So on such easy things, it's really worth to work on a lot and to make athletes aware with such video analysis, or just to show them the different times here if they choose different solutions. That's not very detailed feedback to the athlete, it's just a general view on it, and already that can gain a lot of speed. So some thinking experiment for you, right or wrong, and it's not to be answered now. And I just made here two statements to think about. It's very important for you as a coach to think about those aspects. The first is the longer cycle length, lower frequency skier. So such a typical long cycle length skier at a given speed and same submaximal speed is a weak skater, I say here. And right or wrong. The second statement is the strong skater increases his speed from low to his maximum clearly and rather by increase of cycle length than by increase of cycle rate, especially at low to submaximal speeds. I just give you these two things to think about later, after, or in between, because I think it's important to discuss that. That's one citation about the study we did in double polling on that question. And if you're interested, you can read about that. That's the macroscopic level. And the second level is the microscopic level. And now we are there where we normally are if we talk about technique training, right? So it's about the technique level in all detailed gear-specific key elements. So we talk about the V2 push-off, the swing in V2 alternate, about in all those techniques, the glide phase, the timing of ski movements to pole movements, about the rhythm and other aspects. So the movement quality in itself, in terms of efficiency and economy. And we try to have here some optimal individual technical solution in detail about those things. That's the microscopic level. We go very deep into the individual technical solution and look at the status and look how we can improve and where the weak points, where the strong points. That's the microscopic level compared to all those macroscopic aspects in technique training. So what we talk about here, and then we very short have a short break, is a general technique optimum, which is, we could define it as an individual target technique. We need to have that aspects of individualization. We cannot generally say it's one solution and it's fitting to everybody. It's fitting to a person with a lot of upper body capacity or low capacity or a lot of leg strength or low leg strength or coordination level. We cannot talk like this. We must look at the individual, and then we have a so-called target technique. So to say the best fitting technical solution in, for example, V2 for my girl I have in front of me with 15 years old in this and that physical condition. and with this and that coordination level. So it's very important to see this aspect, and we have a kind of individual optimization of the movement. And there are individually optimal movement solutions for every person. It does not mean that we have hundreds of different solutions. We have key factors that everybody has to fulfill, but certain aspects must be individual. And as I said, I cannot recommend a person with a rather low upper body capacity to ski a lot of, in a race now, in a race strategy, to ski a lot of V2 in a steep uphill. That's nonsense. It's far better the athlete is using V1, having a 50-50 force production upper lower body than 80-20, for example. In the training, that's something else. Knowing V2 is 80% upper body propulsion, then in training, I can use that as upper body training. But in racing, I would not recommend that for the weak upper body skier. So that's interesting to know from research what the results are about skating here, for example. So it has to be understood as the concrete form of target technique adapted to the person or target group specific characteristics, and there are many. I mean, it depends. Do we have a child? Do we have youth athletes or adults? Do we have male or female sometimes? This is, I come back to that aspect. We know still, and it's still a big reserve in female skiers, is the upper body capacity. We need to still develop that more in female skiers, in biathlon and in cross-country skiing. It's far away from being fully developed. We have some examples where it is, but from Norway it's somewhere else. But it's for sure a big performance reserve still. And we have high performance, we have medium or low performance, depending on the training age and in general, and on the conditioning level. So that those things have to be absolutely focused. And then we have something like a nominal value. So that's kind of this optimum. It's a singular technique parameters like push-off angle during skating, ski angle in a skier, describing a general optimum in the sport. And as I said, we have a so-called bandwidth of these nominal technique values. In skiing, it's not only one solution. It's a mean value curve with some standard deviation around, so to say. There are more possibilities, and certain aspects are crucial, but around it's certain different solutions. And the question, of course, in training is how can we control and change this? So if we are not fulfilling an optimum, and I come to examples now very soon, then we need to make a systematic reduction of the differences between these actual values. So this status, how I ski in V2, for example, so in this technique level, versus the nominal value of a technique. We have to change it, stabilize it, automize it, rechange it, relearn it, break it, restabilize it, etc., etc. So that's everything in this microscopic technique training level, what we have. Some examples now, it shouldn't be too long because we must go to the learning process about what is an optimal skating technique. And I just chose 2-3 aspects here. First, we can talk about the push-off movement. That's important for all skating techniques, and it's a very similar mechanism behind it, how a push-off should be performed and how the force should be transferred to the edge of the ski in a pretty optimal way. I show it here for V2, but it's the same for all the techniques, so to say. If we have a skier in the gliding phase here, we see here pictures from 2 skiers from the front and from the side view. In that position, before the poles go down, we should have some kind of, we have, depending on the speed, a little bit lean forward position or a kind of mean middle position, so to say. If it's fast, it's a bit lean forward. If it's not so fast, it's in the middle, so to say. Then we start to go down and start to edge, and then we reach this deepest position. And this is like a squat, a single leg squat. That's an element like in squatting in the gym. And you see the mistakes in skiers on the skis and also in the gym in the same way. And here already the problem starts in skating. If you are in this movement down, don't come to a nice middle position here, as you can see. here, so it should be really nice central position. So I should keep the center of mass above the feet, have a kind of even pressure distribution along the length, the anterior posterior direction of the foot, and on the whole edge, of course, on the heel and on the front foot. That's a very, very important position here, where I produce a lot of force on the edge, and where I, so to say, get the grip on the edge. I cannot get that if this is not in a central position. That's very essential. And some skiers are already too much on the toes in that position. The problem starts. And then I start pushing actively. I extend all my joints, hip, ankle, hip, knee, and at the very, very end, ankle joint, not too early. And I produce this further on, this force that goes a little bit down, but the highest forces are in the deepest position. And at the end, I extend also, have plantar flexion here in the ankle joint. And overall, in this whole process, as you can see, you should kind of try to keep the center of mass perpendicular to the ski direction. Not necessarily from the side view, so to say, but from the correct side view to the ski. The ski is angled, so I must a little bit look from behind into the system. And we should keep this around 90 degrees to the ski. Then we have a lot of rebound on the edge, and we have an optimal push-off movement. So it's, schematically, we can look into this like that. So we should not go into a situation like a little bit like in diagonal ski, such a mix, such a not sideways push to the ski, a little bit too much backward or diagonal backward, like in a little bit like in diagonal skiing. We can't do that. We have no grip. We have only the gliding edge pushed into the snow. And so that's schematically on the left side what you see. It's a gliding edging squat, so to say. The blue one is the right movement down to the deepest position. Here already the problem starts. And we hang in the toes, we hang in the poles, especially in V1 uphill. And the push after will for sure go backwards instead of sidewards to the edge of the ski. And this was measured in 3D analysis. So we measured this resultant force towards the ski in this alpha angle. And in top skiers, we found the following pattern. This is a ground reaction force. It's the forefoot force in blue and the heel force in red. And we see the phases of the movement here. So this is from the upward position in the gliding to this deepest position here. So we have a nice even pressure distribution on both sides in forefoot and heel. So we have a very, very full stance, not full stance on the whole surface, but on the edge during that movement. And then very late, we open up the ankle joint. And that's a typical pattern in top skaters, and in not so good skaters, we have the forefoot force far higher than the back foot force in this period here, from this to that position and in the first part of the pushing. So that's a typical pattern, so to say, an optimal pattern. And this is the angle that we defined, this green line. It's not a line, but it's around 90 degrees in the whole face. And that's characterizing a good push-off in skating. That's the same in speed skating, in inline skating, and in cross-country skating. This is published in my PhD here, which is, by the way, translated to Russian because the Russian Biathlon Federation, Nikolai Zagursky, was once translating this, and there's a booklet about it, just to inform all of you. That's described. And in a video, we can see what does that mean in real. Consequences of a not so good push on the right side, the black skier, is that we have a lot of rotation in the leg, in the whole system, if the push goes rather backwards and the ski pendulum is not perfect, as you can see. So first in real time, the left skier, the white one, has a very good push off, the right one, not so good push, the black one. And in slow motion, you can see here with some markings, a nice catapult effect on the white skier and a big momentum on the black skier, big rotations, problems with the gliding, costs a lot of energy and not a direct close of the legs because the weight transfer cannot go full by that reason. So that has a lot of negative consequences. So that's, for example, one aspect how we talk about optimal technique, push-off movements, very central thing. not easy to train, and one of the most difficult things to establish if we are fatigued, if we are on uphill, if we are on flat, in different skating techniques, but it's always the same mechanism. And it's the same mechanism also in dryland training, in squatting, and in related sports like inline skating, roller skiing, speed skating, and similar things, or alpine ski skating, whatever you use. A second aspect is a very important element in different skiing techniques. It's the so-called arm swing, especially in V2 alternate. Here's an example from some other technique. It's a very important technique, not used enough. This is in West Siberia in the roller ski track here. Left skier has pretty good arm swing. The right skier has absolutely no arm swing. Not using this element at all because it brings us a lot of forward propulsion if we make it properly timed to the pushes of the legs. But it's also very important in this V2 alternate technique on the left side down. A master of this, that's why the picture is still there and you can read the name, was Thomas Alsgaard. It's still showable, his videos in that aspect, because he's one of the best arm swingers in the world. I analyzed him a lot in my PhD and later, and this is a really, really good example for that. And I shortly talk about this. If we look back in other sports, this arm swing element and swing elements is proven as important in many other sports. In jumping, in walking, in running, in sprinting, we have these old examples of the halteres, so they took weights in their arms to jump further on and so on. That's a very important element to get more push-off from the edges of the ski if it's well timed, the arm swing to the push-off movement of the legs. It's all about the timing and it's all about how the arm swing is performed. And this is, for example, a graph. We see here a ground reaction force on the y-axis in percent kilogram body weight. And we have time in percent cycle. And this is nothing else than compared V2 alternate both sides. It's the one side, the red side, which is the leg push-off accompanied by a double poling movement. And the other side, the blue one, is the push-off movement and ground reaction force accompanied by a nice double arm swing in V2 alternate. And it's pretty interesting to see what's going on here. On the pole side, I mean, of course, we have to add the pole forces. We would have to add, but I look only on the legs now. We have on the red curve, pretty much lower peak force than on the blue curve. So the arm swing side creates necessarily higher peak forces and a shorter ground contact in the whole push-off and a steeper force development in the edging movement, in the pushing movement. That's a pretty interesting aspect because the consequence is that after the arm swing phase during the cycle, we have, this is the velocity forward in meters per second in a V2 alternate cycle. This is the pole push accompanied side. So we are here about almost 4.95 meters per second. And here we are even a little bit higher in this skier. On the arm swing side, this is a very good arm swing skier, what we see here. And that's pretty interesting because everybody would think, the pole push side with the leg together, here we come out faster in the cycle than from the other side. That already shows how important arm swing is. Here you see a picture. The skier above is not well coordinated in the arm swing. It's not really an arm swing because the skier is not waiting during the gliding phase with the arms in the back position. To then, as soon as the skier is ready to push with the leg, to fully swing through both arms forward. But Thomas Alsgaard here below, compare those two positions, please, in pink. Same leg position, but completely other timing of the arm position. So he now starts to push with the left leg and can continuously and simultaneously swing the arms cross forward in a very, very intensive, efficient way together with the push-off. And the girl up here in the picture has no arm swing anymore, actually. She's just putting the arms to the next pole push, but it's not swinging. And that creates a big difference in speed. in every single cycle on a long race. Yeah, we saw already Hetland, who is really perfect in that. Go over that. And then we made a study in Burkhardt ski tunnel to analyze how important is arm swing. So we have a well-timed double arm swing here in this video. No poles, we just looked at the arm swing in skating. A badly timed arm swing. So kind of simulating the picture we saw before. Then a single leg arm swing, we wanted to know is there a difference, and no arm swing. And we did that in different speeds, and also in max speed trials and so on, and compared this. And the very quick message here, this was with 3D analysis here with cameras, infrared cameras and force measurement bindings here. We measured everything in kinematics and kinetics. And what was the result? So we have here without arm swing, badly timed, single arm, double arm, well timed. So we have an increase of without to double arm well timed of 7% in maximum speed. So that's a lot. So arm swing is really important. Like leg swing is important in classic skiing, in diagonal skiing, for example. The effects on cycle length are also tremendously big, 11% more cycle length. And by that, the frequency can go down. Pretty interesting result. And this is published if anybody's interested in the details here. And a last example is the so-called double push I showed already, coming from the inline skating. On the top animation you can see, so pushes from both edges, so to say. We saw that video, and that shows another example. On the left side, double push 1-1, on the right side, just a jumping 1-1, so to say, but not pushing from the outside edge. That's that new technique, if we can talk about a new technique in that case. It's published also in 2 papers, who is interested in details. And what we find with double push is in flat terrain, it's far faster in 100 meters compared to normal V2. And on the right side, we see it in the uphill. It's far faster than conventional V2. And it's also faster if you compare the 2 gray in 7-degree uphill than V1. That's pretty interesting. So if you're able to double push skate, you have an advantage. Okay, so now we have to go into the learning process and to look what is important in technique training in general. And that's a little bit philosophical here. I think technique training is a culture thing. It's an attitude. It's a belief, a credo, or for some even a religion. It's a necessity. It's a daily matter of course, like brushing the teeth from kids to top elite. It's a fixed part of planning and fixed part of training in every endurance training. It's a factor of self-awareness and mindset. It's a form of self-expression. So I go a little bit, depends on the country, but in Scandinavian countries, some think it's something like to express your artistic feeling about it. It is a creative process, and it's the sensitive brother or sister of performance. So some statements which are really, really crucial to me, at least as a technique coach. What does it need? It needs joy, it needs curiosity, it needs planning, it needs testing. So it should be planned, like a physiological test in your training plan. I don't see so many plans where technique test is planned. It should start early. We should grow up with it and get aware. So to get, it should be something which is totally normal. We need some coach convincement and positive examples that it helps in our performance. We have to learn it's good. We need a lot of self-responsibility in technique training of the athletes and discipline. We need body feeling and realistic self-assessment. So how do I judge my techniques in detail myself? And we need a creative environment leading to an intrinsic will and seek for the best technical solution. I mean, it's like a prayer, but I think it's enormously important aspects what I tried to list here. Just made it from my mind to maybe find an approach here. So one example, analysis and observation, macro-micro analysis, video or force systems we can use, or GPS systems. That's what we can use, possible elements. There are a lot of different things in technique training. macro analysis first. Then we use training modes like video training or biofeedback training, simulating or giving a quick feedback or simultaneous feedback. We create awareness level, so make things aware. That's not always good, but sometimes it's necessary. We make something like a cognitive education to athletes by that. What we did often is we installed a skier-to-skier observation and analysis. So a kind of technique mentor system. A skier coaches the other skier. We have a regular self-assessment, what we do, of the athletes. We have track memorizing sessions. We have equipment adaptation sometimes. We match the pattern to the equipment, if possible, in the boot something, in the ski something, in the stiffness, etc., in the poles. Of course, then the main part is the exercising, variable exercising, repeating in fatigued and unfatigued status. We have a combined endurance and technique training sessions as a daily habit. It's possible, more or less, to do not a single endurance training session without technique elements. It's possible. It does not always need extra time. It's often an argument, we don't have time enough for technique training because we do so much endurance training and strength, but it's not the matter. You can combine this in your endurance training. Skating movement experiments are necessary on a certain level. So motivate to try something out, to try the double push or something else. And we have a kind of coach education established within athletes, so they make some easy coaching courses already in the ski gymnasium and so on. So there are a lot of aspects which are relevant. And that's one example of self-assessment I do all the time because it's very interesting to see how the athlete sees the level. These are school marks in Austria. The worst is 5, the best is 1. And how the athlete is judging himself in different techniques and how I as a coach are judging him from all my analysis with him. And interesting to see, is it matching? Is the athlete over or underestimating himself towards my reference or towards many coaches as a mean value reference? But I think it's very important to establish self-assessment in athletes. About the different learning levels, Knut for sure will talk a little bit more. That's a topic in itself, how we approach in the very young ones to the top elite. I will not go into this. And I want to, as the last part, talk a little bit more about the micro training options. So what are we really doing here? The key factor in changing a technique or optimizing a technique, let's say we already can somehow skate, somehow, not on a good level, but we have a rough form of skating in a 14-year-old boy. The key factor is information processing about the skating movement. So we know something about the optimal technique. We have had some examples, and we need to somehow, and there are a lot of different possibilities, to give feedback on the movement. That can be very, very different. Feedback is very variable. But we need feedback to the system, and because an athlete is a system. And we need to create and stimulate information processing on a very, very high level in a very different way. To control and change a technique. So there are two possibilities, main possibilities. We give external feedback. This is this typical combination of a video plus a verbal comment of the coach, of an athlete, a colleague, or we do something like biofeedback training. I come shortly to that at the end. A second part is internal sensory feedback. It's a sensory feedback. All our sensors are learning when we skate and when we make exercises on skating, difficult ones. That's one of the definitely most important things. External feedback is important, but far more important is to offer exercising, internal sensory or perception or self-feedback by exercising. That's definitely the most important. We tried everything in training regimes. We made only video training, for example. We did not have that success, independent from the athlete. So it is all about exercising. So internal feedback by sensory variability training, variable exercising also called, and you can also call it the so-called dynamic system approach. It's nowadays called differential learning. And what is differential in that? I give exercises, tasks that create differences in the perception of the execution of a certain skating movement, for example. Let's say I make only leg work training, push-off training, and I give different tasks, hard pushes, left hard, right low, changes of this. I will create on all sensory levels differences all the time. And the system is comparing, learning. That's exercising, and that's internal feedback. How should that be? If we look at the movement in skiing sports, alpine skiing, a lot of no push-off is the same on the right side up in the curves. You see a variation. It's a similar curve all the time, but it's not, no push, no curve is the same. The biathlete or cross-country skier, no push is the same. It's similar, but not the same. The ski jumper is a little bit more similar because ski jumping is not that variable than alpine and cross-country and biathlon. But we have variation in the execution of the movement. And if we go back to Bernstein, it's pretty interesting. Let's say this is a skating force curve we measure. This is the necessary force we want to create for propulsion. And then we look into the system. There's some variation. They're not all the time the same, as you can see. Then this brown is the externally caused internal force inside the body. It's a kind of reactive behavior phenomena. And this green are the muscle forces compensated by the central nervous system. That's what we are doing. And this is all the time changing. We need to change the dose of muscle input every step in skating, depending on the changing conditions. But we always want to create a similar force. So you see the green and brown part is all the time changing. So we have a macroscopic level where it's not so variable, but we have a very high variability on the microscopic level. And this is a fact. That's in shooting and skiing, everywhere a fact. We have a high variability on microscopic movement level. And this we must train. We cannot stereotype in training if we know it is so. We need to learn the skier to adapt fastly and to create a neural network to gain a lot of these different green parts of muscle input into the movement. That has to be learned. That makes adaptability. So what do we have to learn in a sport with changing conditions is you can't repeat the movement in exactly the same way that we know. So the constant consideration of the not influenceable dynamics of the environment, it's changing. The snow is changing and the weather is changing and the hardness and the conditions are changing, stands in clear conflict with the some way existing possibility to imprint standardized motoric formulas to the brain. We cannot imprint patterns so much, and we should not. We learn patterns, but we should not make them stiff. So overfitting or overteaching is really not good for us as skiers. We need to give variability in exercising. Even in the video feedback, we can do that, but in exercising mainly, very, very important aspect. So a necessity is variability, differential learning. And this gives us an increase of the spectrum of fast adaptability in changing conditions in the shooting range, in the track, outside, in changing snow, in changing fatigue status, etc., etc., etc. So that's what it is. At the end, we want to create, by our exercises, we give self-organizing processes. And that's why it's called differential learning in sport. Perception differences we want to show. And one possibility is to give a variation in the movement. We can have small versus large flexion extension ranges of motions. We can ski in a deep, high body position, big versus small steps, ski angle wide, narrow, speed variation, hard push-off versus soft push-off, etc., etc. Or in feedback with different helps, visual, acoustic, kinesthetic, or in conditions, open shoes, closed shoes, different surfaces, different bow length on purpose, different ski stiffness, different ski length, vary in that. That already helps a lot. And these are three possibilities that we can have a methodological approach for this. into it. Very nicely summarized what is meant by variable exercising is in a product we made for the Ski Federation and in general. Some of you might know that it's called Perfect Skating. It's for upper level in the blue part, and for this red part, this is for kids, game oriented. And you can choose a lot of different exercises for all the different aspects of different skating techniques, like pushing, gliding, rhythm, arm swing, arm push, and go into details from very easy exercises to very difficult exercises. So that's a nice model for you to look into. And I just want to say that this can also be implemented in endurance training by making some zones on the endurance round that you have. And on each zones, you give different tasks. For example, like here, you can see this is a more strength-oriented exercises on different zones on the standard endurance round that you have. All those exercises are following the principle of differential learning. These are kind of technical-oriented strength exercises, but at the same time, strength and technique training. And this is part of endurance training. It's not separate. And I show one short surface here. And I try to share, change the share here on the website. Do you see the website, Teresa? Can you confirm?
Yes.
Okay, so there are different parts, and if you about technique training, about all the techniques, biomechanics, easy one, and the orange part with all the exercises. And I just try to show one example that you see what it is here in the English version, exercise pool. Then we go into different techniques, and I take, for example, V2 alternate, and I go into rhythm. So we have bowling, push, glide for each technique and rhythm. And here are the exercises from very easy ones to very difficult ones that show just some examples, description of the exercise, variation possibility, and the video explanation to the corresponding exercise that we see. So this is a more easy one for arm swing technique. And I go to very difficult ones that you can see. It's a Super 3-1, it's called. Only one skier could perform it anymore. A double push on one leg here with side change in a certain rhythm. And this can be, for example, in endurance training in a certain zone. It's not harming your endurance development at all. Not at all. So you can always use it. Or a nice synchronous exercise here of the two skiers. Very difficult, especially for the skier behind. Pretty challenging to keep the rhythm. So this is for rhythm and complex forms. You get the same in each technique for pushing, for gliding, from very easy to very difficult ones, all based on differential learning. Okay, and the last statement. Jump out here quickly from the sharing because I have to change this mode. So this is all about internal feedback. And if you want to have it external, which is of course a possibility, and here we talk about things like computer supported video training, that's also feedback, of course, but it's external. Can be combined with exercising, but it's mainly external. We have biofeedback training systems. We have nowadays smart technology GPS systems. And I go very quickly here through. This is video examples here. If you use, for example, Kinovea, as we work with the athletes, with a lot of key positions, head-to-head comparisons. That's very important to use it, but don't overuse it. Use it when it's necessary after a nice internal feedback weeks, 3 weeks with a lot of exercising. Then show the athlete how he improved in a head-to-head, like here in the arm swing on the right side up. So that's such possibilities how to use softwares. And I show one example, which is nowadays fantastic because there are smart technologies, and this is one called Archinisis. It's a combination of GNS and IMU systems with a very small sensor here on this girdle. And you can do a lot of different things here, like shooting time analysis, speed comparison, continuous split time, section analysis, cadence and cycle info, and sub-technique identification. This is, for example, shooting times here on different sections, and also in detail in a Vuokatti race here in Finland, which was used here in prone, and standing shooting with the different shooting times and in between intervals. That system gives you only one sensor. You can get desirable split times here. So you can click on the curve in the profile and it gives you all the split times you want, everything in every round, in each athlete you want to compare with, in absolute and in percentage values. That of course helps the technique process. That's more macroscopic, it's times. It's not about the movement itself, but you can, for example, compare a use of V2 versus V1 in a steep uphill and compare the times in one athlete or between athletes. That's very interesting. It's combined video with a speed curve here in the downside end. So you have a technique analysis plus speed development depending on the technique level. Very important. And this is a cycle characteristics graph with cycle duration, cycle speed in the second, and cycle distance, cycle length. Depending on the technique you're using on the right side, each color is a different gear 2, 3, 4, and so on, downhill. So you can make comparisons here. And this is, if you go into the cycle, you zoom it out and you see exactly every spot here is one push. So you have double poling, diagonal skiing, and so on. And this is a altitude profile. This is the time difference from lap to lap or between skiers. So you see in which lap you lose time and how much on the downside table, what you see here. So for example, it's very interesting because you can go into a track, you use different techniques for same section and see the physiological response and the performance change. For example, V2 versus V1 in steep uphill versus double push skate. And then you can see what fits individually better for you. So that's very much like this, or this is a sub-technique in percent over the whole track. You see exactly how many percent you use on the track, which technique, and that can correlate to performance individually. And this is the last curve here. This is, for example, 2 skiers to each other or 1 lap to each other. Green would say where you were faster than the other athlete, and red would say where you are slower than the other athlete. So it gives you a really nice picture why and when you lose speed towards another skier or towards yourself overlaps during fatigue. So there are a lot of different such systems nowadays. There are several more. We have pole force systems. Wolfgang was announcing that yesterday. So we have one system where you can measure power and you get directly the forward propulsion. It's so-called ski sense system and other GPS oriented systems. Okay, I'm ready after a long talk, a lot of information for questions, and I'm really happy that it was possible to present that topic. It's never time enough, a lot of interesting things, but maybe something comes up in the discussion and further on in our cooperation. Thank you very much for listening properly to a lot of information from my side. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Stefan, for this very interesting presentation about skating technique and all the details you mentioned that need to be considered during training sessions with athletes. So what I found very interesting was the fact that it's very much also about individualization when it comes to the optimal skiing technique, and that every athlete needs to find his or her own optimal way on how to reach the maximum efficiency in skiing. So when I look into the Q&A section, I can see already one question that came up from our participants. So what is your experience in technique training on snow or on roller skis? See that you are using examples from roller ski.
It's pretty clear to answer. Of course, roller skiing is not completely the same like skiing on snow, but it's a little bit hysteric sometimes among us coaches. It's that we discuss it's so different and so on. Of course, it can be as much as similar then as best as we can, for example, with the friction coefficient in the rolls to match it with a friction coefficient on skis. But you know, even within snow, the friction coefficient is so different. So it's a nice differentiation factor, actually. It's rather helping the learning system. And for skating, I don't see any big reason not to train a lot skating technique on roller skis in summer. I don't see any reason, as long as you vary a lot, because you will never stiffen the pattern. There's not a danger at all. A little bit more critical is it in cross country if you train a lot of diagonal skiing, because you always have grip on the roller ski, and that's a bit tricking you and not telling you the right feedback on a not so optimal push-off and gliding pattern in diagonal skiing. But in skating movement, I don't see such a big problem. I would even recommend that you also go a little bit speed skating, even if the rolling resistance is far too little. Speed skates are far too fast, but it will also give you a benefit. I mean, not only, but a little bit. I would even recommend that. So I don't see the problem in this. It's overestimated, in my opinion, because the reason is the movement variability. I said movement variability is needed, and that exactly gives you some variability. I would even say maybe you vary your roller skis a little bit from time to time. You don't always use the same wheels. You use a little bit more, a little bit less resistance, faster, slower wheels. You use on the right side the fast wheel, on the left side leg slow wheel, and vice versa, and you change it, etc., etc. This is the key.
Okay, thank you, Stefan. So we have actually two questions that are nearly the same, and they are asking about how important is the transfer of classical technique to skating when we talk about young athletes.
There is some transfer in general mechanisms, of course, although, for example, the pushing movement is pretty different. We see the classic ski, the diagonal ski push-off is in skating often not seen as such, because you cannot push like, but something like crosswards pushing in skating skis. And that's really something we don't want in skating. In skating, we must hit the edge around 90 degrees to the edge of the ski. It's necessary because along the ski, we have no possibility to transfer forces. We can only go through the edge in the snow. And if we go a little bit like diagonal skiing, this is not wished. So too much forward lean, too much go into the poles, etc. It's not wished in skating. That pushing is not so beneficial, but it's not, there's no danger of disturbance in a stable pattern situation. A young athlete with 15, 16 is already kind of stabilized enough to, of course, nicely also train diagonal skiing in biathlon. And there's no danger that the skating technique will suffer from this. In a very early age, I mean, it's a bit tough to answer that in a short, at least I would not ski too much diagonal skiing, or not much more than skating. Because this is a learning phase, and we should here a little bit focus on the skating movements, although in very young kids we need both anyway, because we need this rich, wide experience in moving on skis in general, with all the key elements of pushing, edging, gliding, turning, curves, and so on. It's very well usable in biathlon diagonal skiing because it's not using the same muscles all the time. It gives you a certain different input to your muscle tendon system and to your cardio system. And that's often good because you're not loading in the same way, and you recover maybe a little bit faster using diagonal skiing and classic elements. But as I said, I mean, as long as the push-off pattern and the other patterns are stable, it's rather enriching each other than disturbing each other.
Thank you very much. And another question. How long do you think an athlete can cognitively focus on internal feedback for a single task? What time intervals do you recommend for focus on technique in training?
Yeah, this is pretty clear. It depends very much on the experience of the athlete, of course. But if you make a single session with 2, 3, 4 athletes together and give different technique tasks on a, let's say, on a 300-meter flat track, back and forth or so, so pretty intensive, one exercise after the other, so to say, then I would not, I never make it longer than 40, 45 minutes. That's absolute maximum. You can always make it super short. That's always possible. You can make it 3, 4 minutes. That makes already sense as part of the warm-up or so. But I would never make it longer if it's very difficult and intensive working on a weak aspect of the athlete, longer than 40, 45 minutes, even not in top elite. But that's a single training session in a very short interval with a lot of exercising, a lot of exercise feedback, internal feedback by the exercise or by the verbal comment or by a video in parallel to that. And I would, yeah, that's one thing. And the other thing is I would not make more, let's say, a skier is weak in the arm swing in V2 alternate. Then I make different variants of arm swing exercises from easier ones to more difficult ones to challenge him. I must challenge him. I must destabilize him a little bit. Otherwise, it's no effect. That's very important. The doses of the difficulty is important for success in technique training. So it must be the correct difficulty. And let's say I work 30 minutes. I would not make more than maybe 5, 6 different exercises, but repeat them a little bit more often. As I said, maximum 40, 45, and minimum is always possible at any time. And if you don't have a separate session, if you bind it in such zones into the endurance training, let's say you have 2 hours development intensity or whatever, and then you can make 3, 4 zones exactly corresponding to the weak points of the athlete and put there some exercises. So there are no limits for it. And in the younger ones, of course, they, let's say 12-year-old boy and girl cannot focus that long compared to Simon Foucault. I mean, that's also kind of natural that we know, I think, right? So it can be a little bit shorter in younger ones. The younger, the shorter maybe. Not linearly, but very young ones rather short. They must be, the most important is the quality, not the quantity. They must be focused. They must be self-internal, unconsciously focused, so to say, to fulfill the task the coach gives or the web app gives you.
Mm-hmm. So then a more difficult question. When you discuss the formula V is CR multiplied by CL, you mentioned CL corresponds more to faster V. Is that because skiers are more likely to have longer glide on flat or gradual downhill terrain as opposed to gradual uphill? Was this formula tested on consistent terrain?
Yeah. This phenomenon that better skiers in general, better cyclic sports people, running, kayaking, skiing, different techniques in skiing. This is pretty clear that at, let's say, a given speed, let's say 25 kilometers per hour, and I have a very talented technique person and a not so talented technique person, but both can ski 25 kilometers per hour. The better one will solve it with a rather higher cycle length, but a lower frequency. And the other one will rather have a high frequency multiplied by a lower cycle length. The reason why this is so is, it's pretty simple. You can create only a long cycle length with one push, so to say, or 2 pushes in one cycle with arms and legs, if you have a good technique on the one hand. So if you direct the forces in the right direction, so to say, and if you have a lot of strength. So it's a combination of strength level plus technique. It does not help me if I put a lot of force to the ground, but in the wrong direction. Then I'm strong, but what does it mean? It means nothing. So strength level plus good technique makes a skier have longer cycle length. And by that, of course, I can go down a little bit with the frequency. That's natural, because it's a product of both elements. That's characterizing better skiers, clearly, that's proven, independent from any anthropometrics. It's not depending on body height. Definitely not, in no single technique in whole cross-country skiing. And those athletes are able to create higher cycle length because they have a better technique, plus maybe a higher strength level. That's analyzed in uphill, in flat, and everywhere. It's a nuance, a little bit different, but the pattern is always the same that we find. It's everywhere the same. I can send literature if this is needed. It's pretty interesting phenomenon. But of course, we know and we see exceptions I mean, if we now start discuss about Johaug in cross-country skiing, then this is an exception. She has a fantastically high frequency, but it's also because she's so fast. She's just faster than the others. That's why it also makes the impression that she has a higher frequency. Of course she has, because she's faster. At a given speed, we would not see that so much, but she is a little bit an exception, I have to admit. So there are always exceptions, but overall, we see this typical pattern. Good skiers are rather long cycle length skiers and lower frequency. And we know from different skiing techniques, let's say double poling and cross country, that too high frequency is very unbeneficial for oxygen consumption. So if you, for example, double pole with 70 pushes per minute versus 45 pushes per minute, that's physiologically extremely unbeneficial. We know that. It costs too much oxygen.
Mm-hmm. So, and one last question for this Q&A session. Coordinated movements of the arms, legs, and trunks are very important, using less muscle and more using gravity. How would you advise to solve this important question in training?
Yeah, that's what I meant. Two examples. One is this swing example. So we have different techniques in skiing. In skating, it's skating without poles. There, this arm swing. So we use the gravity of the mass of the arm limbs, so to say, to swing in the right direction, to have a very wide range of motion of swing, to have a good timing as regards connected to the push-off. So that are the things where you can use exactly that for propulsion. It costs partly also a little bit something sometimes, energy, but it's overall, it's more using the mechanical advantages of such a pattern if I'm able to do that. And then I train that a lot. I train a lot arm swing for V2 alternate or for double arm swing or for skating without poles, for example. Or in diagonal skiing, leg swing timed to push off of the other side. Leg and arm swing in diagonal skiing. Extremely important, the swinging movements in diagonal skiing. I can gain a lot of benefit per cycle with that. So we measured that you can only, by doing that better on a 50K in cross-country skiing, you gain 3 minutes. Depends on the speed and on the person, but so that's one example. Or in double poling, which is not in biathlon, but in Nordic skiing in general, if you have more up and down movements, for example, in the legs and in the upper body, then you use the upper body mass to create pole forces in double poling, for example. And if you are not moving your hips and your flexing, extending your hips and your knees very much, then you do not use that benefit. A third example is in sit skiing in Paralympic skiers. Some classes cannot move their trunk to produce because they have a high impairment up in the breast somewhere. And some who have only amputated legs, they can have a full trunk function. They can let the upper body fall down on the poles and produce force by that. That's, of course, you have to stabilize that. You have to counteract it, but it's kind of a mechanical benefit, and all those aspects, all three examples, you can highly train with exercising, with video feedback, with other, with such biofeedback systems like this Achenisis, what we talked about. It's fantastic possibilities nowadays. I mean, you have to choose. And you cannot do everything at the same time. You must make a concept when you use what. But I can in generally say that exercising is the most important thing to do that as a daily life activity thing in a skier. It's like cleaning the teeth. It cannot be any day actually without anything in technique training. And it's not necessary. It's not time consuming at all.